I asked him, would you be ready to go in January? He said, yeah, maybe. So how about the end of the fall? He goes, yeah.
Three names, three men, one industry that has spent years, decades even, trying to make sure none of them ever stood in the same room together. Mark Wahlberg called Hollywood a monster, not in a tweet, not in some carefully crafted press release designed to generate buzz before a film premiere. He looked into a camera and said it like a man confessing something he had been holding inside for far too long, like someone who had finally decided that the weight of staying silent was heavier than the risk of speaking up. Jim Caviezel made a film about child trafficking that grossed $251 million at the box office, and the entire mainstream media apparatus responded with a wall of silence so complete, so coordinated, that journalists who had spent their careers covering the entertainment industry suddenly developed collective amnesia about how box office numbers work. And Keanu Reeves, the most universally beloved actor in Hollywood, a man so genuinely good that even people who hate everything find it impossible to hate him, quietly became one of the most dangerous figures in the entertainment industry. Not because of anything he did wrong, because of everything he refused to do. Stay with me here, because what you are about to hear is not a collection of rumors or unverified gossip. This is a pattern, a very specific, very deliberate, very traceable pattern of how Hollywood as a power structure responds when someone inside its walls decides to stop playing by the rules. And right now, three men are breaking those rules simultaneously, and the industry is not ready for what that means. The blueprint. What happened to Jim Caviezel? To understand what is happening right now, you have to start with Jim Caviezel, because his story is not just a cautionary tale. It is the operating manual. It is the blueprint for exactly how the Hollywood machine neutralizes threats. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Most people know Caviezel from The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's 2004 film that Hollywood tried to destroy before a single frame hit the screen. The smear campaign started before the production wrapped. Industry insiders were calling it anti-Semitic before they had watched a single scene. No major studio would touch it. The establishment consensus was that it would be an embarrassing flop that would follow everyone attached to it for the rest of their careers. Then it made $612 million at the box office on a $30 million budget. Let me ask you something. When a film makes that kind of money against that kind of institutional opposition, what does that tell you about the people running the gatekeeping operation? It tells you they were not making a commercial calculation. They were making something else entirely, a values judgment, a decision about what stories were acceptable to tell and what stories needed to be stopped. Because if it were purely about money, studios would have been racing to distribute that film. They weren't. The money came anyway, without them. But here is the thing that most people gloss over when they tell this story. After The Passion of the Christ, Jim Caviezel's career went quiet. Suspiciously, uncomfortably quiet. This was a man who had just starred in one of the highest-grossing films of the century. In any rational industry, his phone should have been ringing for years. Instead, Hollywood simply stopped calling. No scandals, no on-set disasters, no personal controversies that could explain the silence. Just a carefully enforced professional invisibility applied to one of the most commercially proven actors in the business. Think about that. Not as a coincidence. As a message. Then came Sound of Freedom. 5 years. Caviezel himself has said the film took 5 years from production to screen, and for every one of those 5 years, according to him, there were forces actively working to stop it. Not passive disinterest. Active, sustained opposition to a film about child trafficking that was based on documented, real-world, legally verified events. Ask yourself the question that everyone watching this should be sitting with right now. Why would anyone in a position of institutional power work to suppress a film about child trafficking? Of all the topics in the world, of all the stories that Hollywood might find threatening or inconvenient, why would this one generate the most coordinated, the most sustained, the most deliberate resistance? Because here is what Hollywood normally does when a socially important topic gains traction. They co-opt it. They wrap themselves in the social justice messaging. They greenlight their own version with their own talent, splash awards season marketing all over it, and take credit for the conversation. They did that with every other difficult social issue that ever crossed their desks. They didn't do it with child trafficking. Instead, they ignored Sound of Freedom, then tried to discredit it, then watched in something close to horror as it made $251 million without a single major studio behind it, without mainstream media coverage, without late-night television appearances, without the critical ecosystem that normally decides what matters and what doesn't. A $251 million film that received no reviews, no morning show segments, no mainstream press coverage to speak of. Has that ever happened before in the history of modern cinema? Name one other film that crossed the $250 million mark domestically and received that kind of coordinated media silence. You can't, because there isn't one, until now. And as the money poured in, something else happened. Caviezel started talking, not like an actor doing press tours, like a man who had spent years watching something operate and had finally decided that more people needed to understand how it worked. He described child trafficking not as a series of isolated criminal incidents, but as a system, an 8-armed octopus, in his own words. An organism that could not be stopped by cutting off individual limbs because those limbs would grow back. You had to take the head. He said these things on Steve Bannon's podcast, on Jordan Peterson's platform, on the Trinity Broadcasting Network. He was not speaking in careful, lawyer-approved Hollywood language. He was speaking like someone who had spent years standing next to real operatives and absorbing real information about how these networks actually functioned. That's when the passive institutional resistance became something else, something targeted, something precise. The destruction of Tim Ballard. Tim Ballard was the real-world human being at the center of Sound of Freedom, a former Department of Homeland Security agent, the founder of Operation Underground Railroad, a man with operational knowledge, documented case files, and years of on-the-ground experience in the specific networks that the film depicted. He wasn't theorizing. He had the receipts. The combination of Caviezel's platform and Ballard's operational knowledge was, apparently, too dangerous to be allowed to exist at full strength. So the machine responded. In July 2023, at the exact moment Sound of Freedom was dominating the box office, multiple misconduct allegations from multiple employees suddenly emerged against Tim Ballard. An independent law firm was deployed. A swift conclusion was reached. Ballard was removed as CEO of the organization he had founded. The timing was, let's say, noteworthy. And then years later, prosecutors quietly declined to file any charges. Insufficient evidence, no trial, no conviction, no day in court. Just the destruction of a reputation at the precise moment when that reputation was most powerful. A shutdown of momentum at exactly the window when that momentum was most threatening to the people who needed it, stopped. The goal was never a conviction. Convictions require evidence, trials, witnesses, a public record. The goal was a distraction, a smear, a way to tie Ballard's name to controversy at the moment when his connection to Sound of Freedom was most culturally potent. And it worked. The director of the film, Alejandro Monteverde, started giving interviews where he carefully distanced himself from the conversations the film had started. He emphasized that he had begun writing the script in 2015. He said the controversy made him sick, that his instinct was to run. Think about what you are witnessing there. A director who watched his film gross $250 million, publicly distancing himself from the star of that film and from the very conversations the film had ignited. Not because the film failed, because it succeeded so completely that the institutional pressure to contain what it had started became overwhelming. That tells you more about the environment these people are operating in than anything else. When success itself becomes the thing that requires managing, when a $251 million box office result makes people run for cover rather than stand up taller, you are dealing with a power structure that operates through means that have nothing to do with commercial viability and everything to do with something else entirely. The man who survived. Mark Wahlberg starts talking. Now, while all of this was unfolding, Mark Wahlberg was watching, And here is why that matters in a way that is different from what you might expect. Wahlberg is not a firebrand. He is not the kind of person who goes on political podcasts and talks about elite networks and blackmail operations and shadowy systems of control. He has built and maintained his position at the absolute top of Hollywood for 3 consecutive decades. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen by being careless with your words or your associations. That is someone who understands the rules of the game at a level most people never reach. So when Mark Wahlberg looks at a camera and calls Hollywood a monster, that is not a throwaway line. That is not a man venting after a bad day on set. That is someone who has spent 30 years inside an institution, deciding that the weight of what he knows outweighs the risk of saying it out loud, even partially, even obliquely. And Wahlberg has the one thing that makes him uniquely positioned to do this. He is too big to be quietly disappeared. The Hollywood machine operates on leverage. It operates on the assumption that everyone has a price, a vulnerability, a career they want to protect, a relationship they cannot afford to lose. That is the mechanism of control. But Wahlberg, after 3 decades of navigating that machine, has arrived at a place where the machine's conventional tools do not apply to him the way they apply to others. He is too commercially powerful, too culturally embedded, too Catholic, and too public about it to be neutralized through the standard methods. His faith matters here, and not in a soft, abstract way. In Hollywood in 2024 and beyond, where openly Christian public figures are routinely marginalized, where studios greenlight anti-religious content at an industrial scale while treating sincere Christian belief as a PR liability, a man of Wahlberg's stature openly and repeatedly refusing to deny his faith is a declaration. He said it himself in those exact words. He does not deny his faith, simple statement, enormous implications. And then, Wahlberg did something that sent a very specific signal to very specific people. He paired up again with Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson and the original template. Before Caviezel, before Ballard, before Sound of Freedom, there was Mel Gibson. And Gibson's story is the original version of everything that has happened since. Gibson made the Passion of the Christ against the explicit advice of virtually everyone in his professional circle. No major studio would touch it. The anti-Semitism accusation started before a frame was finished. The establishment consensus was unified and vocal. It was going to be a disaster. Then it made $612 million. And Hollywood's response was to wait, not to destroy Gibson immediately, to wait until he gave them something to use, because everyone gives them something eventually. That is the axiom the machine operates on. Wait long enough, and the leverage will emerge on its own. Gibson's personal failings, his moments of weakness, his controversies, every one of them was amplified, repeated, and weaponized to justify pushing him out of the rooms he had spent decades earning access to. But here is the thing that the people executing that strategy miscalculated. Gibson never stopped working. He kept directing. He kept producing. He made Hacksaw Ridge, which earned him an Academy Award nomination, and left the establishment in the uncomfortable position of having to either acknowledge a masterpiece or expose the extent to which their opposition to Gibson was never really about craft at all. They were uncomfortable. They gave the nomination. They did not give the award. And Gibson kept working anyway. Now he is circling back, pairing with Wahlberg on Flight Risk, and the industry is watching that partnership with the kind of nervous energy that only comes from people who have something to lose. A Gibson-Wahlberg collaboration is not just a film right now. It is not just 2 commercially powerful actors deciding to work together, with Sound of Freedom's cultural aftershocks still reverberating, with Caviezel's words still living rent-free in the public consciousness. A Gibson-Wahlberg collaboration is a statement. 2 men who survived Hollywood's attempts to sideline them, choosing to work together and refusing to pretend that the last decade of the industry's behavior hasn't happened. Keanu Reeves and the danger of being leverage-proof. And now we come to Keanu Reeves. And this is where you need to pay very close attention, because Keanu's story is different from all the others. And that difference is precisely what makes it the most significant piece of this entire picture. Keanu Reeves has never needed Hollywood's approval, not truly. When Fox Studios blacklisted him for nearly a decade after he refused to star in Speed 2, his response was not to grovel. not to take the first terrible project they dangled in front of him to buy his way back in. He waited. He did the work he believed in. He made the films that felt right to him. And then, with The Matrix, he came back larger than he had ever been, on entirely his own terms. 10 years of professional blacklisting for refusing to make a sequel he didn't believe in. And he survived it, not by learning to play the game better, but by refusing to play it at all. That is not how Hollywood is supposed to work. Hollywood is supposed to work through leverage, through the understanding that everyone wants something badly enough that they can be managed. Fame, money, access, legacy. The system works because the system knows what you want, and the system controls whether you get it. Keanu Reeves gave away portions of his Matrix earnings so the special effects team could receive bonuses. He took pay cuts so other cast members could be paid more. He rides the subway. He sits on park benches. He has been photographed giving his lunch to people living on the street. None of this is calculated. None of it is strategic PR positioning. It is simply who he is. And in an industry that runs entirely on knowing what people want, what they fear, what they will do to protect their position, a man who genuinely does not care about the trappings of power and wealth and fame is essentially leverage proof. And leverage proof, in Hollywood's language, translates to one word, because authenticity is not celebrated in that system. It is a threat to a system that depends on everyone having something to protect, something to hide, something they need that only the gatekeepers can provide. Now Keanu Reeves has become one of the most vocal opponents of a very specific technology: deepfake manipulation, unauthorized CGI alteration of an actor's likeness and performance. And on the surface, this reads like a straightforward labor dispute, an actor wanting to protect his image rights, a reasonable concern about the future of the industry. But step back and look at the timing. Look at the context, and ask yourself a question that I want you to sit with for a moment. In a world where the most powerful people in entertainment already use every available tool to control narratives, suppress information, and destroy reputations, what does it mean that they now have access to technology that can put any words, any expression, any action into the mouth and body of any human being on the planet? Caviezel talked about it in one of his interviews. The image of a single tear added to a performance without an actor's knowledge or consent. His face, his body, his performance, manipulated into conveying an emotion he never felt, a statement he never made, a moment he never chose to create. Now scale that up. If a studio can add a single tear to Keanu Reeves's face without his permission, what else can that technology do? What false confessions can it manufacture? What fabricated statements can it place in the mouths of witnesses, whistleblowers, investigators, or victims? What evidence can it construct from nothing and then distribute through the same media infrastructure that already decided a $251 million box office hit was not worth covering? This is not speculation. This is the logical endpoint of a technology that is already deployed. And Keanu Reeves is one of the only people in Hollywood with the combination of public trust, moral credibility, and genuine personal courage to stand up and name it as a systemic problem rather than a contract dispute. He is not just protecting his brand. He is throwing a very deliberate, very public wrench into a machine that needs those tools to maintain its grip on what the public sees, hears, and ultimately believes. And that makes him something that the people running that machine cannot afford to ignore. The name everyone is dancing around: Epstein. Now we need to say the name that ties every thread of this story together: Jeffrey Epstein. Caviezel has told the story of screening Sound of Freedom for audiences and watching something extraordinary happen. At a specific moment in the film, audience members, unprompted, unrehearsed, not journalists, not commentators, not political activists, just regular people who had paid for tickets to see a movie, spontaneously cried out the same name: Epstein Island, multiple times, in the same spot, at multiple screenings. Regular people connecting the dots in real time, making the link between a film about the trafficking and exploitation of children and the most infamous alleged trafficking operation in modern American history. Not because someone told them to, because the connection is not hard to make once the story is actually in front of you. Here is what the mainstream conversation about Epstein consistently fails to confront. The network did not end in that New York jail cell in 2019. One man dying under circumstances that forensic experts have publicly contested. erase the blackmail material, or neutralize the decades of compromising information about the most powerful people in politics, finance, media, and entertainment that his operation had spent years accumulating. In 2026, the Department of Justice moved forward with a mandatory disclosure involving millions of pages of files tied to Epstein's activities, court records, communications, investigative notes, an archive of information that had been sealed, partially hidden, and carefully managed for years, is now piece by piece entering the public record. And Caviezel said something in one of his interviews that deserves to be heard very clearly. Epstein Island isn't the only island. Let that land for a moment. The man who made the highest-grossing independent film about child trafficking in American history, who worked directly alongside real operators with documented field experience, who spent years absorbing information about how these networks actually function from the inside out, is telling you plainly, clearly, without qualification, that Epstein was not an isolated case, that the island was not unique, that the structure that created and sustained his operation is still intact. And Hollywood, the single most powerful storytelling apparatus in human history, the industry that shapes what billions of people around the world consider normal, desirable, acceptable, and true, is, in Caviezel's framework, deeply structurally embedded in that world. The same media companies that own the entertainment studios, the same conglomerates that control what gets made, what gets distributed, what gets reviewed, and what gets quietly buried. The same institutions that looked at a $251 million domestic box office result and made a collective professional decision to pretend it did not exist. Those are not separate entities operating independently of each other. They are the same machine with different faces. The faith factor and why it matters more than people realize. There is one more thread that needs to be pulled before this picture is complete, and it is the thread that the mainstream conversation consistently undervalues because it sounds soft, because it sounds like it belongs in a different kind of story. Caviezel is unapologetically, openly, operationally Catholic. His two most iconic and most culturally significant roles have been explicitly spiritual: The Passion of the Christ and Sound of Freedom. Both projects that the industry wanted nothing to do with. Both projects that became cultural phenomena the moment they reached audiences. Wahlberg has spoken publicly and repeatedly about how his Catholic faith did not just shape his worldview, but literally saved his life. It is not decorative for him. It is structural. It is the foundation on which every professional decision he makes is built. And in an industry where Christian content is systematically underfunded, undermarketed, and treated as a niche product despite consistently demonstrating massive commercial appeal, that is a declaration that carries real professional weight. Gibson built two of the most financially successful faith-driven films in cinema history against explicit institutional opposition both times: The Passion of the Christ, Hacksaw Ridge, both dismissed before release, both phenomena on arrival. And the commercial data here is worth stating plainly because it directly contradicts the narrative the gatekeeping system uses to justify its own behavior. Sound of Freedom was not a failure at the box office. It was a phenomenon. The Passion of the Christ was not a failure. It was a phenomenon. Hacksaw Ridge was not a failure. That audience shows up in extraordinary numbers. So the resistance is not commercial. It cannot be commercial. The commercial argument against faith-based content is definitively, repeatedly, empirically disproven every time a film with genuine Christian conviction is allowed to reach its audience. The resistance is ideological. It is about what stories the people controlling the gates believe should reach the public and what kind of cultural landscape those stories should create. And here is the deepest layer of Caviezel's argument, the one that operates simultaneously as theology and as systems analysis. The idea that storytelling itself, the control over images, over narratives, over what is presented as normal and what is presented as shameful, is not a neutral creative exercise. It is an exercise of power. Enormous, intimate, generational power over what billions of people believe is real. In that framework, a man like Caviezel, who explicitly connects his faith to his work and his public advocacy, is not just making movies with a Christian message. He is challenging the ideological ownership of the most powerful cultural production apparatus in human history. More than any box office number, more than any political association, is what makes the machine genuinely uncomfortable. where we are now, and what comes next. Line it all up, look at the full picture. Jim Caviezel makes a film about child trafficking. The film is delayed for 5 years by forces he describes as active opposition. Hollywood ignores its release. It makes $251 million anyway. The man who provided the operational knowledge behind the film has his reputation destroyed through allegations that never result in charges. The director publicly distances himself from the star, and Caviezel continues talking, louder and more specifically than before. Mark Wahlberg, a 30-year survivor of the Hollywood system, a man who understands its rules at a foundational level, calls it a monster and pairs back up with Mel Gibson, the man whose story represents the original version of everything Caviezel has since experienced. Keanu Reeves, leverage-proof, morally credible, universally trusted, becomes the most vocal opponent of a technology that, in the wrong hands, can fabricate reality itself and distribute that fabrication through the same institutional channels that already demonstrated their willingness to use their power for suppression rather than disclosure. And underneath all of it, slowly, document by document, filing by filing, the Epstein files continue to enter the public record. The machine is loud, the machine is resourced, the machine has tools that it has not yet fully deployed. But here is what the machine has always struggled with, what it struggled with when The Passion of the Christ made $612 million without its blessing. What it struggled with when Sound of Freedom made $251 million without its coverage. What it struggles with every single time someone with genuine credibility and genuine courage decides to simply tell the truth in public. The machine depends on silence. It depends on everyone having something to protect. It depends on the assumption that the personal cost of speaking is always higher than the personal cost of staying quiet. And right now, 3 men have independently, at roughly the same moment in history, arrived at the same conclusion, that the cost of silence has become the higher price. What comes next is not something any of us can fully predict, but the Epstein documents are still being processed. The cultural conversation that Sound of Freedom started has not been contained. The technology Keanu Reeves is fighting against is not going back into the box. And Gibson and Wahlberg are making a film together in an environment where the industry knows exactly what that partnership represents. Hollywood, for all its power, for all its resources, for all its ability to manufacture reality for global audiences, cannot stop what is already in motion. The only question that remains is how many more people inside the machine are going to reach the same conclusion that Wahlberg, Caviezel, Gibson, and Reeves have already reached, that the storm is here, and staying inside the machine is no longer the safe option it used to be.